For 2 centuries, historians have argued over who won the War of 1812. But there's a much more fascinating question. How did the fledgling United States, with 10 million citizens, fail to capture a barely defended Canada, which had barely 500,000 settlers? The American narrative told them it would be a mere matter of marching. They expected a parade, a swift victory, and the annexation of everything north of the border. They saw only British weakness. They missed the one thing that stood in their way. The untold story of how an unlikely alliance, driven by a desperate fight for survival, stopped the American dream cold. This isn't the story of a war won by kings. It's the story of how Canadian identity was forged in fire. In 1812, the British were focused on Napoleon across the ocean, leaving Canada nearly empty. U.S. President James Madison and his war hawks saw an irresistible target, and they were dangerously arrogant. They believed the settlers in Upper and Lower Canada were just waiting for a chance to defect. But they fundamentally misunderstood the motivation of the people living there. This was not a war of expansion for the settlers. It was a desperate, emotional fight to protect their homes, their land, and their way of life. They were unprepared, outnumbered, and surrounded by the defense wasn't about a single army. It was a desperate alliance. First, you had Major General Isaac Brock, the charismatic British commander. Brock understood that the war would be lost in the first weeks if he didn't act decisively. His brilliance was simple. He understood the power of psychology. Second, you had the First Nations warriors, led by the legendary Tecumseh. For him, this was a war to protect his ancestral lands from American encroachment. The American failure to invade rests heavily on the unbreakable alliance between Brock and Tecumseh. And third, you had the Canadian militia. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. They were poorly trained, but they were fighting for their family farms, not a distant empire. They knew the land, and they held the line. The defining moment of the early war wasn't a bloody battle. It was a bluff. Brock and Tecumseh marched on Fort Detroit, held by the terrified American General William Hull. Brock, knowing he couldn't win a sustained siege, used fear. He dressed his poorly trained militia in leftover British uniforms to inflate their numbers. More critically, he had Tecumseh and his warriors march visibly past a gap in the woods, only to circle back and repeat the march, making their forces appear limitless. Hull, fearing a massacre by the warriors, panicked. He surrendered Fort Detroit without a single shot fired. This was the emotional high point for the Canadian defense. It shocked the Americans. The War of 1812 ended not with a dramatic defeat, but with a stalemate. America failed because of a potent combination of its own arrogance, its military's incompetence, and the sheer will of an underestimated, diverse defense force. The war didn't just preserve a territory. It instilled a fierce, regional pride in the Canadian people, a sense of identity formed by successfully standing their ground. The border we know today was cemented by those sacrifices. What lessons do you think this untold story of standing up against overwhelming odds holds for Canadian identity today? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see the hidden history of other regional conflicts, like the Red River Rebellion, hit that like button and subscribe to Canada Untold.